Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Joan Phelan to us today. Thank you.
My name is Joan Phelan, and I am new, so I don't know many of you. I am not new to the area. Our family has lived in Silver Spring for 27 years, and for 25 of those, we've been members of St. Albans, and I'm recently a member of St. John's, and so I'm very grateful to Sari. This is not something that I do as a profession. My job is teaching high school boys at DeMatha Catholic High School, but there are a lot of connections between parenting and teaching high school boys. But what my hope today is that this is not a lecture or a narrative by me and then questions by you at the end. I would love this to be a conversation. So I will tell you my story or parts of my story, but I encourage you to interrupt with something that reminds you of your story, because my story is really others' stories that have sort of impacted me. And before I get to stories, I do want to give the morning a little bit of structure, because I don't want to lose time at the end about what to do about some of these problems. So I'm going to cite somebody that Sari cited a couple of weeks ago, a man by the name of Greg Boyle. And I read Greg Boyle's work, Tattoos on the Heart, maybe 7 years ago. And he has articulated what I hope I do in my life and what all of us should do in our lives. His new book is called Barking to the Choir, and it's one of his employees confusing barking up the wrong tree and preaching to the choir. And Greg Boyle thought it was such a fabulous collaboration of those two idioms. He said, that's going to be the name of my next book, before he wrote the book. So you are the choir. I am going to bark at you a little bit because the choir wants to do the right thing. The choir always wants to do the right thing. They want this world of justice, this world of peace, but sometimes the choir gets very complacent in terms of what they've been used to doing, and that's good enough. And Greg Boyle would say that that's not good enough. The other writer that has informed my life, articulated what I hope I try to do every day, is Bryan Stevenson, who wrote the book Just Mercy. And he gives 4 steps that we should all do. And I'm going to start with those, and I want you to think about those all through my story, other people's stories, how we take a step forward. The first one is proximity. You have to get close to people, and you have to get close to people who are not like you. He would say you have to get close to people who are on the margins. So would Greg Boyle. The second one is to change the narrative. So I hope today my narrative will change the big societal narrative of fear, of the other, of the outsider, of something that you've heard maybe all your lives. The third one is to be hopeful, to believe in things we haven't seen yet. I remember 9 years ago when Barack Obama was elected president, and there were people that were talking about this post-racial society and this colorblind society. At the time, I had 3 teenage African-American sons at home, still young enough to be at home. And I thought, what are these people smoking? Post-racial society, colorblind society, what are they thinking about? We now know, in 2018, we are not in a post-racial, colorblind society. So I have to have hope, and you have to have hope, that there's the possibility of things we haven't seen yet to come. And the last one, if I remember, the last one is a commitment to being uncomfortable. And so you're here, and that alone is a commitment to being uncomfortable, because you don't know what I'm going to say, you don't know what my story is, but we've all gotten into our little silos of friends and people that we hang out with and people that we work with, and Bryan Stevenson said we have to change that. So those are the 4 things. Then Adoption is, a description of adoption can be what Greg Boyle said is radical kinship. As an anthropology major in college, I would say it's the definition of fictive kinship. My children do not come from me biologically. They do not come from me through marriage ties or anything like that. They were children that I had no idea would be my children. And I can't imagine not having them as my children. I'll tell you today, I am so grateful that I was infertile, because I wouldn't have the children that I have right now, and they were supposed to be my children, and they were supposed to be each other's siblings. And I don't know how that all happened, but I know that that's right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and then I really want to turn it into more of a conversation. I was lucky enough, I remember a few weeks ago when, Joe, you talked about winning the lottery. I won the lottery too, in terms of my own family. I grew up just outside of Boston in a very working middle class town. Lots of Irish, lots of Italian Catholics. My parents were incredible activists, civil rights activists. Most kids went to Catholic school. I went to public school. My mom and dad had 7 biological children, and then my mom decided in 1967 and convinced my dad that she was going to do something much more intentional than just march. So in 1969, she adopted my youngest brother, Earl, transracially. So he came to us as a 2-year-old African-American boy in a completely white town, and in a pretty racist white town. My first memories of Earl and me are taking him downtown and having people throw things out the window at us, of people screaming the N-word at us. We were devoutly Catholic. When he would come back from communion, people would whisper the N-word as he walked down the aisle. So I sort of grew up with that around me. Earl went to public school in this town and was a scholar, was an athlete, and could never, ever date anyone. No prom dates, no dates, because even though his peers were accepting, their parents were accepting. So for me, adoption was just kind of part of my world. So by the time I got married and we thought about having a family, I knew that adoption would be part of it. I just didn't know it would be all of it. So for me, some of the feelings about racism and adoption started very early on, before my children even recognized it. Like, I would go to the grocery store, and probably every week someone would say to me, "Oh, where are they all from?" And it would be very disappointing to that person when I said PG, Southeast, Northeast, Alexandria, and Atlanta, because they wanted to hear Mali, Kenya, maybe my white daughter was from Russia, right? There was something very exotic about that kind of adoption, but there was nothing exotic about, and so I thought, I'm still going to answer them, but then the questions would stop, right? No more interest at all in my children. As they got older, they clearly experienced racism on their own. I had the very interesting experience of having 2 girls. One of my daughters is biracial, one is white, all adopted, and 4 African-American sons. And they grew up in the same house, with the same parents, with basically the same message when they were very young. But by the time they were in middle school, if there was a police car in my Silver Spring neighborhood, the girls would want to go out and ask the police, "What's going on? Why are you here?" The boys didn't want to leave the house. So that's growing up in exactly the same home, right, with basically the same message. I'll tell you, my middle son, 3 different times he entered school. I'll tell you 3 different experiences he had. When he went to kindergarten, his first day in kindergarten, he was put up against the wall during recess as a mistaken identity, because as you all know, all black children look alike, especially all black boys. So another little boy had done something that he shouldn't have done, and my son got put up against the wall for the entire recess. 5 years later, my son's walking into, oh, Mark, I didn't even realize this. Mark Edwards and my son grew up together, and Keith and Matt were walking into Sligo Middle School together, best friends. And they were fooling around, joking with each other, nudging each other. Well, the principal thought that my son was harassing his son. So again, in front of the entire school, my son is pulled over to the side and disciplined. So then 6 years later, college, he went to Santa Clara University. And he was a soccer player, and there early, walking back from soccer practice with eight soccer players, six of them white, Keith and another boy, African American, and there had been a robbery in the neighborhood. The police stopped the 8 boys, told the 6 white boys to go on, and Keith and this other boy were forced to sit on a curb with with handcuffs on in front of the freshman dorm as all of the new freshmen looked out on this scene. 2009. And I just want you to know that those things happen on a daily basis. My husband just went down, my son is in the Coast Guard and just had some surgery. My husband went down, they went to an auto repair parts together. Lena was in front of Chuck, and so he got to the counter first, and when he got to the counter, the man looked around Lena and said to Chuck, "May I help you?" And Chuck said, "As soon as you help the person in front of me." Those are things that happen every single day to my children. My oldest son was stopped in his own neighborhood for riding a bike because the police officer thought that he didn't belong in that neighborhood. He was stopped on the way home in downtown Silver Spring in his ROTC uniform from St. John's, going in to deposit babysitting money at the Sun Trust because they thought he couldn't own an ATM card, a bank card. And that experience certainly colors them, certainly wounds them, wounds me, and you do feel pretty helpless about what you do about it. You know, you certainly acknowledge the rage, and believe me, there is rage at being treated this way. And again, I'm saying to you, this happens in Silver Spring, and I know this is Bethesda and that is Silver Spring, but you even know the difference. There's just 2 or 3 miles difference between Bethesda and Silver Spring, and they're 2 different worlds. I mean, I don't know how many of you, lots of Silver Springites come to Bethesda. I don't know how many of you go to Silver Spring, but it's a different world. It's a very, very diverse, integrated community, and it still happens there. So you can imagine when you're in Marathon, Florida, or Gary, Indiana, you know, some of these places, how tough it is. So those are some of my experiences, but I would say to you now, we have to get close to it, right? This whole idea of kinship. I work at a high school, and it's probably one of the most integrated high schools in the country. It's about 50% African American and 50% white. We deal with race every single day, but we deal with it in a very open, full of some tension ways, and I think that's what we as adults still aren't very comfortable with, right? We're not comfortable with the discomfort of talking about this. We think it happens to somebody else. We think it happens once or twice and, oh, get over it. It happens every day to people. And it's a wound that's an open wound. My son that I told you about that happened 3 different big points in his life, lives in Hong Kong, and said, it's the most wonderful feeling to not be afraid of the police. And really doesn't want to come home. He says it is such a freeing experience to know that even if a police officer comes into a restaurant or a club or something like that, that we're all going to be handled exactly the same way, that I'm not going to be singled out. So I do think the proximity, the change the narrative, the agree to be uncomfortable, and that we know there's going to be a different place. When I think about President Obama, I think often about my brother Earl. My brother Earl went to Yale and Harvard Law. And when he lived in Newton, he's opened up, he runs schools in Gary, Detroit, Indianapolis. When he lived in Newton, because he first ran schools in Boston, he was stopped almost every night in his apartment complex thinking that he was the plumber, the electrician, the janitor, the parking garage guy in a three-piece suit. There's a disconnect there. There's a real disconnect, and it has to be acknowledged that that's not an innocent, that's not an innocent assumption. That's something that lies in each one of us, right? Just the other day, I was talking to someone, and they were talking about friends of theirs that come over from England and how they're so disturbed by the African American teenagers' language. I don't know how many of you have listened to any teenager speak these days, but all teenagers, or most teenagers, have inappropriate language, whether they're on the metro, but they had already pigeonholed that it's this group of African American teenagers who have this kind of language. So I'd love to open it up. I'd love to hear other people's concerns. I'd love to hear what you think should happen, but we have to start talking about it because it really hasn't changed very much. We've coded it in a different way. I'll tell you one other story. For a couple of years, I worked at Jessup in the prison doing GED training. And people would say to me, oh my gosh, that must be so scary. That's a maximum security. The thing that's scary about Jessup is the physical surrounds of it, the sounds of it, the metal against metal, the never any quiet because it's so loud there, there's nothing soft. But the men that I worked with were not very different than the high school students that I work with. They were very often 18, 19-year-old kids who had gone to prison for a nonviolent drug charge, were in there for a long time because of some of our ridiculous laws, and they were literally not different than the boys that I teach at DeMatha Catholic High School. And people seemed amazed at that, but at the same time this week we had a judicial nominee not be able to answer the question, is there implicit bias in the criminal justice system? He couldn't answer that or didn't want to answer that. And I don't know how that can happen today.
Well, Joan, I was going to put Joe on the spot just for a quick second, because as you were telling your story, Joe and I, of course, were immediately nodding our heads at experiences that Joe has had. And would you mind telling the story of going to high school, just very briefly, because part of the reason I'd like you to tell the story is that what the actions that your parents took collectively have made a huge impression on you, and we as parents will follow in those footsteps. Back to Joan's points about, being in it. We can't shy away from the issue, particularly as parents with our kids.
So, can everyone hear me? Okay. So, Joan, your story was struck home. So, I was in 9th grade. So, at that point in time, that was still junior high school, and two of my friends who were African American, we were in class, and the assistant principal, who's white, comes and gets us. And she does a lineup, right? She puts us all against the wall. And she brings out this 8th grade white boy. And she says, okay, which one of you, and she has him next to her, and the three of us are against the wall. She says, okay, which one of you did it? And so my friends and I are looking at each other, like, do what? Like, do what? And she said, which one of you pushed this boy at the water fountain? And none of us had done anything. We were all in class, so we couldn't have done anything. And we weren't like that anyway. We were all athletes, and we were like, what? We haven't done anything. And so that went on for like I don't know, half an hour, let's call it. Send us back to class. She says, I know one of you did it. You know, we're going to have to talk to your parents. So we all, at lunchtime, called our parents and said, hey, this is what happened to us. And all of our parents, you know, my parents have master's degrees, my friends' parents have master's degrees, they all left their jobs early. And my parents are from the South, okay? So
And this was in Colorado.
and this is in Denver. And so my parents don't play. Okay? They are, let's just put it this way. If you mess with their children, you know, you messed with the mother cubs, bad things happen. So they all 6 parents, come to school and get the principal, not the assistant principal, go directly to the principal, explain that this should never happen again, that why don't they do this with all kids? All of a sudden, 3 black kids. They didn't rest until the assistant principal was fired. They were relentless until the assistant principal was fired, and that they had changed the nature of the policy in schools were changed, that could not happen again. But that was, you know, one of the first but the first significant experiences that I can remember of this happening to. And, you know, for no reason.
I think, you know, Greg Boyle would tell all of us, because now my children are grown. My youngest is a senior at Maryland. And so they needed all of that support, the kind of support that Joe talks about. But again, that happens within your family, and that doesn't protect you out there, right? That happens, they can come home and I can acknowledge their rage, and I can go to the police department and say, this is incredible, I did that at Santa Clara, right? And they supposedly change things. If you think that I believe that they're still not doing it, not true. But what Greg Boyle would say, which helps me more, is that all of us have to think in terms of spaciousness of compassion. We have to think that there's something in us that's so wide and so vast, to look at people and to not judge. And so I have to think this even in terms of people that I'm judging right now, people that have done things to my children. I have to look at them and not judge them for how they're carrying their burden, but be compassionate with the fact that they have this burden of racism. I have to be able to do that, because I want to be able to do that with other people. Once I open myself up, I always thought when my kids were little and I was on PTA, I thought one of the best things that PTA could do was to have everybody in the PTA pick a name from a hat and advocate for that child all year long. Not your child. I mean, you can advocate for your child too, but that child as well. That starts to create this kind of fictive kinship. I'm going to learn about this kid, and I'm going to start caring about this kid as much as I care about my own. Nobody ever thought it was a good idea except for me and maybe a couple of other people. But I think churches can do that as well. You can literally mentor or get to know somebody. I think it's one of the reasons why the LGBTQ thing has changed so much. You can't demonize people you love. And we all know people who are lesbian, gay, trans. We know our colleague's son is, we know my niece is, we know my daughter is, and so we can't demonize those people because we love them. But we don't love enough people who are other than us. This last week, one of my former students buried his mom at 42. He lost his dad at 8, he has no siblings, and he's alone in the world. And because I got to know him as a student, he let me in. And I was able to watch this 19-year-old boy care for his mom as she died of ovarian cancer. And at the funeral, which was just this week, he stood alone at an open casket and welcomed almost the entire Dominican community of, I think, Washington, D.C., to it with smiles, with grace, with peace. And I thought, to me, it was one of the holiest 2 hours I've ever been a part of. And I would never have had that experience for me if he hadn't let me in. And Greg Boyle says this all the time. You're not going out there to fix anyone. You're going out there to fix yourself. I need to fix myself. I need to heal myself. And in order to heal myself, I have to be close to other people. So I do think that you have to think about not just writing a check, although checks are incredibly important. You have to get near people so that they share with you.
And it happens all places. I have a granddaughter and a good friend who live in California, and they both have biracial children. And they have been one lives in Walnut Creek and one lives up in Sonoma. And at grocery stores, they each, when their kids are babies, people came up and asked if they were the nannies and how long have they been the nanny. And they said, well, since I gave birth to them. So it's just not in other places. It's also in what we consider liberal communities.
Two things I just wanted to share because they were on my mind. Actually, the first one I'll mention is because of what you said, and that is my daughter-in-law is Hispanic, and so we have a wonderful 4.5-year-old little girl in a co-op, and so the parents were all there. They're helping each other, and my daughter-in-law typically gets the question sort of like yours, which is, how long have you been a nanny from the other parents? Because it's sort of not conceivable that she could be the true mom. And so that's preconceptions. But the heavier weight on my mind is something that a conversation I had yesterday with my sister in Philadelphia. She's a teacher, like you, 5th grade. And she was relating her experience. It's a inner city school, and it's diverse racially. One of the little boys, 5th grader, had his good days, bad days, but that sort of comes with the territory. But one day he came in, and he sat at the desk, and he put his arms down, and he just sobbed for the morning. He just kept crying and crying and crying. It's right after Christmas. And she pulled him aside and tried to talk with him, but he couldn't do much more than sob. Well, the nice thing about the school is that he developed some attachments to other teachers there who had taught him for the entire year, and some people, and also some friends. And the word got back to my sister, whose name is Peggy, and it was that his best friend had been shot to death, also a 5th grader, over Christmas break, and his heart was breaking. So my sister, with his permission, asked if she could give him a hug, and she did. And he accepted, and she did. The story doesn't end there, because a couple months later, he was back there, and this time, uncontrollable tears, head on the table, rolling down the cheek, his body just shaking. And he had twin older brothers who went to a neighboring school, and one of him had been shot to death. So here's two. And so my sister has a style of one day a month she declares this is birthday day, and everybody who had a birthday in that month gets a celebration. So she picked his birthday to do it. And then what she did was, because all the class was broken up at this, she says, would anyone who wants to just touch him? You said get near, just touch him, rub the shoulder, something like that. His best friend gave him a hug. And then she ended with a hug this time. He said yes and did it. So he had the human attachments, but in a cruel and changing thing. So when you talk about burdens, those that live in the inner city carry a fear and a burden. And I'm not just saying it's African Americans, it could be Hispanics, it could be a white child, but they carry these special burdens, and it marks them. And then we say later on, why did they react that way? Walk their shoes and see what you find out. But a little act of kindness can make a difference.
Bryan Stevenson says he thinks the Great Commission, Jesus' Great Commission, is for us to be near to each other.
I'm also a transracial adoptive parent. My 9-year-old daughter is from China. And obviously the racism and bias that Asian Americans face is different from what your children have faced, but it's still out there. And I wonder, as a white parent, like, how have you helped your children learn to navigate that and learn to respond to something that's so far outside your own experience?
Well, they've helped me, obviously, right? They've helped me, but I've been lucky because my whole family is kind of interracial. So my kids have had African-American uncles, they have African-American cousins, so I've been lucky with that, and I've used those resources like crazy, but I've also used resources outside my family. Because you're exactly right. I can't experience the same kind of anguish that my sons have, or that your daughter will have. Daughter? Yeah, that your daughter will have. And so, in some ways, isn't that a great thing? Because in some ways, it forces you and me to be vast, to be spacious about what we need, right? I mean, I think one of the things I've learned most in terms of adoption and adoption of African American kids is my humility. I am not the person in control, right? I can certainly be supportive, but I have to recognize my own limitations, and I have to ask for help. So I would say that I mean, it's the old phrase that it takes a village, right? But it took a village in your sister's school. It doesn't take one person putting a hand on that child's shoulder. It takes a community of putting hands on that child's shoulder. And Greg Boyle would say again that we used to be in the philosophy of, gang members, to help them, they need a job. And he said, we realize now they don't just need a job. Yes, they need a job, but they need to be healed. And in some ways, what he's saying is we need to be healed, right? It's not always about them. It's about all of us need to be healed. And we can do that together. And I think all of us know, I've heard everybody say so many times, when you do some kind of service, oh, I get so much more back than I give. We know that feeling. It's in all of us. We just don't, we maybe just don't do it enough, and we don't talk about it enough, and we don't maybe do it when it's the most difficult to do it. I need to reach out to people who I would prefer not to be around. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. You guys are easy, right? I need to be saying things like this to people who don't feel the same way I do, right? Who say to me, you're wrong. Your kids just need to buck up and get on with it, right? And that's what people have said. If you're an African American kid, you so often get asked, my daughter in college, well, how do African Americans feel about this? Like, she's the spokesperson for all African Americans?
No,
I mean,
Joe is. Joe's the spokesperson.
There's a bias there, and you can ask a different question. You can say, how do you feel about it? Right? How do you as a person feel about it? We have some, yeah, go.
Well, I have two stories. My son is adopted from South America, and he's been with me since he was newborn. And as he grew up in this environment, he definitely, and he was, an acolyte and choir member right here at St. John's. But when he was a student, he worked in the restaurant trade, as many students do. And he was pulled aside for being an illegal immigrant at one point. And that was, I had to provide the documentation and so forth and so on. And I said to him, does this happen? This was the first time I'd been really involved. And he said, yes, it happens more often than you'd even know. But the more painful and personal story relating to his growing up was I didn't come from a family with parents that were activists like yours. My son was kind of a cut-up as a little kid. And, I always thought he was the sunshine in my life, but others didn't often perceive it that way. And we were visiting my parents out of town one time, and he did something that my father didn't approve of. And I said, well, give him another chance, or I'll talk to him or something. And my father said, That's about all you can expect from people like them. And I was absolutely dumbfounded, absolutely speechless that he had harbored these feelings about someone that was so near to my heart. And it caused a rift in the family, and I didn't get together with my parents for a number of years. It really was a terrible moment in my life.
I have one very much
But
like that.
I just wanted to say, he lives in Silver Spring, which he finds very agreeable. One of his children looks like his wife, who's very Scandinavian, and the other is the spitting image of him.
Oh, how wonderful.
And they all get along
How wonderful.
beautifully.
My in-laws were much like your parents, and I would get a note or a message on my phone almost every week about how to straighten my daughter's hair.
Oh.
From my father-in-law. You know, he would watch Oprah religiously, and if Oprah was talking about a new hair product that straightened her hair, he would pass that on to me. And my daughter is 4 at the time, with an afro that's surrounding her, you know, her entire head. So I know how painful that is.
Just a story about our experience at Ascension. I was rector of Ascension in Gaithersburg, and when I got there, we had one person of color who came to church and one person of color who sort of stayed home. And when I left, we had 500 to 600 African American people. And the transformation were people from Liberia that came to the United States fleeing the Civil War. And it started with one person. And gradually over a period of 3 or 4 years, it just grew and grew. And we made a very conscious decision, the leadership. We were not going to talk about race. And that really came from me. But I was more interested in what happened in their country, what happened in their family, how did they deal with their anger, what it was like to be parents, because they all fled with a suitcase and a toothbrush and a couple of kids, and most of them on foot. And I think, and I'm no authority by any means, but I think it was because we focused on what we shared in common. That allowed us to become the community we were. The people from Liberia, changed us by being able to talk about starting all over, being able to laugh, being able to love their children, not be consumed by anger. I didn't know any white people that going through that, and I don't know, who wouldn't want to get a gun and go out and kill somebody. And we listened to people who had been through a civil war, learn how to forgive and to laugh and to start over. And a lot of these people, doctors and lawyers and teachers, started at McDonald's just to get food and money to pay the rent. It was a transformative experience for the congregation. But I think that if we had started on the issue of race, then it never would have happened. But we could start as fathers and mothers, and we learned a lot about Liberia and about the beauty of West Africa. And all I can say is that community changed us as a community. And it was great I learned more than I ever could have learned.
I'm just going to bark at you a little, because I completely understand and cherish that kind of transformation. I think it's impossible not to talk about race if you're dealing with African Americans. It's one thing, I mean, I see immigrant families come to high school all the time from Liberia, from Africa, from even the Caribbean. And there's not the same for them, there's not the same experiential history that's here in this country. So it's a whole lot easier to find commonality with an immigrant community coming from Liberia. I mean, that's why there's even quite a bit of tension sometimes between African immigrants and African Americans. There's a very definite tension between that. But my parents would have said to my brother, they wouldn't have talked about race nearly as much as we probably do now. My parents would have said, you're strong, you've got a strong family, you can do it, you can be better than everybody else. My kids shouldn't have to be better than anybody else. My kids should be just have to be as good as your kids are, right? They shouldn't have to be better to be equal, right? And I think my parents' generation, as wonderful as my parents and as activists as they were like, you know, keep your chin down, do the right thing, you know, and he did, and it still didn't work, right? So I think in some ways I mean, I always worry about somebody saying to me, it's just all about love, isn't it? Transracial adoption is just all about love. It is about love. It's it's so much about love, but it's also about honesty, about where they're growing up and how they're growing up. And it's about acknowledging the kind of anguish and rage.
First of all, thanks for being here. I was very glad that you mentioned Bryan Stevenson. I would suggest that as a first step to become more aware of this issue, and certainly the criminal justice issue, is to read Just Mercy, a best-selling book by him. But the other thing I wanted to mention is I work for Prison Reform Advocacy Group, and you don't have to go to Jessup to volunteer in this venue. 3 blocks from the White Flint Metro is the Montgomery County Reentry Center, and they are always in need of volunteers for just what you did in terms of helping people study to pass GED, getting their resumes together, and that's run by the county. So,
and you get close to someone that way.
Exactly, and they're very short staffed. So that's one action you can take on the local level.
Thank you so much for coming to talk with us. You mentioned that you're working on a school that's quite diverse, but there's still tension among the students. Could you talk a little bit more about how the school deals with that?
Yeah, well, it's a school that originally was all white, like back in the 50s. It's in PG, just down the street from University of Maryland. But as Prince George's County has changed, our school has reflected that demographic, and we also have a mission our mission is that we're going to take students of all incomes, all races, and all academic abilities. So unlike a Gonzaga, unlike a Landon, kids can get into DeMatha with pretty lousy grades. So what I do there is I run an academic support program to help kind of catch those kids up. But because of our kids coming from PG, Anne Arundel, Calvert, Montgomery, I think we see more division right now than we've seen in the last 10 years since I've been there. And I think it's just reflective of the division in society. I mean, when the election happened, people were a little bit afraid. People were afraid to come to school because people were afraid that other people would be gloating about coming to school, and but we talk about it all the time. We talk about it in class. We have regular things called character conversations where we will talk about things like the NFL kneeling, protest of criminal injustice. And I think in the last year, I've noticed young people not being able to listen to each other as much, right? And for us, our whole school is about what binds us together, the brotherhood, the kinship that we have by the end. And I still think that we get to that. But this year I was in a freshman homeroom, and it got almost to, it was yelling and screaming, and it almost got to physical stuff. But we're not afraid of getting to the the conversation about it. We don't steer away from it. And I think that's the thing. And we do it within the kind of Trinitarian, we've had Greg Boyle come to talk, so we do it with that acknowledgement that we are divided in some things, and we have to work it out. We have to listen to each other's stories, and that's why I wanted so much for this to be me as much listening to you talking, because it can't just be about my story. It has to be about your story and your story and your story and people's story that we don't know yet. And so that's what we try to do in high school. And I'm lucky enough to work with kids in small groups and one-on-one. So I get to do it in a small group setting where we're talking about as much social stuff as we're talking about academic.
All right, I'm not sure if there are any more questions.
I know I have to get into my
one more,
choir
yes.
robe.
We're getting close. Yes, we're getting close to that.
Okay, Joan, you and I have shared a lot of stuff together, but at the church that we were at before St. John's, I was on the vestry, you were on the vestry, and I was on the vestry with an African-American woman who became a very close friend, but I think I will never forget it, and I was so startled. I grew up in western Nebraska. My high school had one African-American child and a lot of Hispanic kids, though. But Lori said to me, as we were on the vestry, and we were trying to start a Hispanic parish there as part of our parish, and I said, okay, Lori, you and I as Anglos, and she looked at me as, she said, Lynn, that's the first time in my life I've ever been called an Anglo. And it was, for me, and then I started learning more about her, but it was because I had no notion that she could be regarding me as racist. We ended up becoming very close friends, but there's still always that little divide between us that she kind of won't let me in. And
I think that takes time.
Yeah.
And I also think where Lynn and I were before, we started a collaboration with the Tubman School in DC, and it's an elementary school that services more homeless kids than any other school in DC, and they have a phenomenal principal. And what I kept trying to help people at St. Albans figure out is that we actually had so much more to learn from them than they had to learn from us. Even in terms of systems, this was a school that had an incredible leader, and the way they dealt with their community was extraordinary, but it's still so hard for those of us who have more materially to think that we're not here somehow to help them. And that's what we have to jump over. We have to jump over that barrier that somehow means that I'm not your sister, right? You are my sister, right? And so is a person that I see on Silver Spring that's homeless. She is my sister.
One of the things I'll add, I know we've got to wrap this up, and Betsy, I'll let you wrap it up. I will just say from my own experience, having gone to a predominantly white high school, few African Americans like myself, probably more Hispanic, so let's call it 70% or so Caucasian, 25% Hispanic, 5% African American. When you play sports together or do something where you all have a common goal and you're all going through the August heat of 2-a-days together, and you are just struggling, you're sweating, but you all have a common goal, all of a sudden you get to know each other. And then it's, hey, do you want to come over to my house for dinner? Or, hey, do you want to, a bunch of us are going to go watch Friday the 13th, part 25. Right? Do you want to come? It's those sorts of things. And then all of a sudden, you see each other as humans. And everything else becomes irrelevant. So, but anyway.
I wanted to thank you, Joan, personally for being here on so many levels, and there's so much more that we could talk about this, whether it's having to do with racial issues, adoption, which is near and dear to my heart because I've adopted 3 girls from the foster care system who are much older now, but there's so much need. and need for community, need for support. And I think the more we share these kinds of stories, I mean, it's just so nice to hear all these different stories of people that had adoption as part of their lives, or racial tension, or some level of racism or prejudice. So much here today, and thank you so much for sharing.